Ghost Stories by Dana Lee. I have a fascination with death. I really can't understand why everybody doesn't, considering these are my ghost stories. I have a lot of them, so I'll tell them in order of occurrence. The first ghost I saw was my grandmother. We were very close. You could say she was my favorite person at the time. I was 7 when she passed. She was an artist and she made me dolls. Her name was Leona, which she hated, so she signed all her work as Lee, my middle name, and where I got the pen name. I was sleeping, having a nightmare. I would always wander off, so my grandfather would tell me old Jack Cack with the sack on his back was going to get me. My grandmother would scold him for that. In the nightmare, Jack had just tossed me into a sack when I awoke. My grandmother was standing over me. She was filmy, like a fog. Psychologists would say that it was a grief-induced hallucination that my brain projected to solace me. It's sometimes referred to as the old hag dream. Ghosts are often perceived at the foot of the bed or standing over the dreamer. But here's the thing to it, and why I can't buy that. My grandmother had expression. She was not some thoughtless phantom. She was surprised that I could see her. Now, how or why could I have imagined that? I've had a couple of students with similar grandmother stories. In fact, there was a soldier who I was connected to on Yahoo, whose story is nearly identical to mine. I always was in touch with the other world, but this was my first encounter with a ghost. So, I've never questioned life after death. I know, and as for many things, I have my grandmother to thank for that. These ghost stories go way back. There are a lot. Chapter 2. My next series of ghostly encounters get complicated. I'll explain. I did not know what was going on at the time, but the last couple of months have shed light on the subject, and that's yet another story. It was the summer before my last year of college. First, I was in the drugstore with my mother when something sinister called my name. This had happened to me before, and I'd stopped turning around and looking and just figured it was the voices in my head. But this time was different. My mother looked at me and said, "Who was that? You didn't hear that?" He just threw his Mack truck ashtray on the floor, and now I'm going to get blamed for it, because he must not want me telling you his story. There are also demons involved. They can read, too. Anyway, sorry to interrupt my story, but you'll see what I mean about them. You didn't hear that? Look, I've got goosebumps on my arm. That was scary. She then proceeded to go up and down the aisle, certain that she'd find somebody playing a trick on me, but I knew she wouldn't. I was scared. This was the first time that someone else had heard the voices in my head. But then again, my mother was born on Halloween. A couple of days after that, I was sick in the hospital. But I can tell you, before I went in, I had gone delirious. You know why? I was trying to keep my soul in my body. It was trying to get out of my head. It was the worst feeling ever, pulling my own hair. I had a lot of hallucinations in the hospital, but they had me all drugged down and were holding me prisoner. After I got out of the hospital, I was down on my brother's floor working on a scrapbook. Someone who was not there put his hand on my shoulder. It was nice. I had no idea of who it could be. I think I would have known if it was one of my loved ones who had passed away. None of this ever made any sense to me. Now it does. My lover and I have been friends all through school. He was graduating, going on to graduate school, and there were many things about him that scared me. I can't go into all of that here. He's very private, but last year, right around Christmas, he had found me online due to the fairies. I hadn't seen him in 13 years, and he wrote me a letter. In the letter, he said that he knew the demons were trying to kill me, and he had sent his brother to watch over me. He was 17 when Anthony died of cancer at the age of 26. But Anthony is another story entirely to himself, and I'm getting ahead of myself, and I am presenting the stories in order. This was written in 2008. Chapter 3. This next series of events revolve around an old house in Oakland, Pittsburgh, where I lived for 10 years. It was a stone's throw from the Carnegie Museum and Mellon's old house, which is now Chatham College, where I went to school. It's a very old part of the city. The house was from 1913. I knew it was haunted my first night there. It just felt dark and weird. The shadows on the wall seemed to play tricks on your eyes, but I had no extraordinary experiences there until January, 11 months after I had moved in. I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It was very dark. I had to go through the living room. The house was very big, and at that time we were living on the second floor. On my way back, I knew someone was in the room with me, but the room was black. Something that was not there hugged me. I should not have reacted the way that I did, I'm afraid, but I totally freaked out. I think that is a pretty natural reaction when confronted with the unknown, but I felt very violated. Maybe if it had occurred at a different time, in a different way, I would not have freaked out, but just afterwards I kept brushing myself off as if 1,000 ants were crawling over me. It was very real. The dog, Macduff, would not venture on the second floor. You know what he did there? I don't even want to tell because it's disgusting. Macduff was very aware of the spirits. I say spirits, but to this day, I'm not sure if the house had at least 3 spirits or if it was inhabited by a demon, because demons appear in many guises, or whatever they feel you'll be most vulnerable to. Macduff crapped in a circle twice in that very spot where I was hugged. He never did that in the house. I think he was trying to mark his territory to banish it. I have a friend whose ex-husband came to visit. Once we moved into the rest of the house, that room was shut off, and there was a pile of old furniture kept there. Only the cat would get in there and howl, because she was in cahoots with them. But my friend's husband went in the room, even though I told him not to. He had no prior knowledge as to the happenings in there. He said somebody went through a lot of pain in there, had died of kidney infections there. Another weird thing about that again he couldn't have known about, was that I had suffered kidney problems after moving into that house. So the next couple of installments will concern that house in Oakland, where a lot of strange things occurred. 2 girls had tried living on the 3rd floor. One lived there for about a year, the other for a couple of months. Neither of them ever spent a single night up there, not alone. One was always at her boyfriend's, the other with her family. They said they were too scared. They'd get on the phone crying, then leave for the night. So it wasn't just me. Chapter 4. Back to the house in Oakland. So many things happened there that I actually wrote a book about it. The book is fiction, but I only share the truth of it here. I was lying in bed when I heard a Victrola playing in the other room. When I got up and entered the room, the music had stopped. Those 2 rooms were actually one back in the day. A dividing wall had been put up in the 50s. In the mornings, the front door would open on its own, and you could hear somebody coming down the hall into the kitchen. This happened so often that I put up wooden beads hanging from the entryway to the kitchen as a ghost trap, but the beads never moved of their own accord. I used to hide from it, lock myself in the powder room, an old pantry off of the kitchen, and listen behind the door. The neighbors next door were very sweet, an old couple in their 80s. They just sat on the porch in the summers drinking wine. The lady's name was Lucy. We shared an old brick driveway. Knowing that they had lived there the past 50 years, I told Lucy about the Victrola and the morning visitations. She said that the Oberholz had lived there up until the 70s when Mrs. Overhaul had died, an old woman, falling down the stairs and breaking her hip. She said that Mrs. Overhaul's mother came over every morning and that they spent the whole day in the kitchen baking and talking. She also told me that Mrs. Overhaul had an old Victrola in the room where I had heard it and that she played it up until she died. Chapter 5. When I last left you, I had introduced you to the first of 3 spirits that haunted the house in Oakland, Mrs. Overhaul. This chapter is dedicated to Mr. Jones. I only ever think that I saw him once, but I'm not sure of that either. I was coming in late after drinking one night, so I'm not a good witness. There was an entryway between the double doors of the porch and the front door. The front door had a window with a sheer curtain overlay. That's when I saw him through the sheer, standing at the top of the steps enshrouded in shadow. I call him Mr. Jones because I was cleaning out the fireplace on the 3rd floor and found labels from old prescription bottles and a half-burned postcard from Kennywood, 1937, addressed to the Jones family. I sing and dance around often, and if I would be playing this Talking Heads song, Mr. Jones, spheres like smoky little bubbles of light would dance around the top of the entryway of the 1st floor bedroom, what would have been the dining room back in the days. You could feel a stir in the room too, like you weren't alone. Mr. Jones was often on the stairs. You would feel someone behind you on the steps, turn around and nobody there. He did not like the man of the house, of this I'm certain. The man had admitted to feeling someone behind him on the steps. He caught himself on the steps, fell down, and broke his arm. I was fighting with the man one rainy evening, and the closet door of the old dining room came down on the man and broke a glass table. The glass continued to crackle and dance across the wooden floor as we stared in amazement thereafter. That closet door was secure upon its hinges. It was not even used, being so shallow as to hold teacups. There was an old sealed dumbwaiter next to it. One night I was in bed on the 1st floor. Macduff jumped up barking and snarling. I felt a presence come into the room and walk right into the bed. Actually, move the bed, which was huge and heavy as hell, across the floor. I was terrified. This was also the same place where the closet was. Macduff did not like him, I told you, and it might very well have been Mr. Jones who had hugged me too. My best friend and I were using the Ouija board in the living room, which would have been the old parlor off of the dining room, which I have spoken. The air of the room was astir. Macduff did not want us using the board. He would sit on my feet, put his snout down the board. My fingers felt prickly. It only repeated, killed 9 times, over and over. It was scaring me. At first I was angry with my friend because I thought she was only scaring me. But on second thought, I think Mr. Jones was an old army vet from one of the world wars. I think he feels unable to pass on due to guilt holding him back. It's all very sad. There was another sad spirit in that house that I'll tell you about next time. Chapter 6. This will be the last chapter dealing with the house in Oakland where I lived for 10 years. I told you in the beginning I'm not sure if the house was inhabited by at least 3 spirits or perhaps it was all the work of demons. But I think there were separate entities involved. You've already met Mrs. Overhaul, who was harmless, Mr. Jones, who was questionable, and now the one I feared the most, who I refer to as Hank. Hank dominated the 3rd floor. I think he died there. Hank is just a boy, but I did not know that for a long time, although I had my suspicions. I told you about the 2 girls who tried to live up there with Hank. The one told me she thought it was a kid when I told her about him. She said she could feel him in the room with her and hear him crying, that he really scared her. The other said the same and that he moved stuff around, which he did. I was in the bathtub one night when I first encountered him myself. After the girls had left, I moved most of my dolls and my studio up there. I did it all jungle leopard theme, but also had a house big enough that I could fill it with dolls. The bathroom up there was a big old walk-in closet for the nursery back in the days. I had a clawfoot tub up there and I loved them. Well, I'm in the tub listening to Bjork when I hear someone crying outside the door. My blood ran cold. I hate to be cliche, but that is exactly how I felt at that moment. My brain was trying to settle me, telling me it was the dog, Macduff, although my mind knew better. And the doorknob began to jiggle as I sat there scared to death. After I was done, I went to look and see what I already knew, that Macduff was shut downstairs, and he never once came to the 3rd floor either. Only the cat would, actually, and she died up there under the bed. It was lovely up there because it was so high as the moon shone through into the windows at night. There was open space in the one room, and I used to dance there. Not a lot, though, because that would bring them on. The voodoo ladies are right when they say dancing calls the spirits. You would just feel him in the room with you. He used to move pictures around a lot. Someone would visit and he would turn their picture face down, which scared me. Nobody else could have done that. My cat did not mess about like that, like other cats do, and it would be weird because it would always be the same pictures of the same people after a visit like that. I had this print, The Fairy Kissed by Pixies by Brian Froud up there. It's big. He took that one down all the time. The nail was always certainly secure, as I would always check it, but he did not like fairies hanging in his room, and I guess I should not blame him for that. If I was ever up there in the bed by the window crying, he would always come sit at the foot of the bed. You could feel it and see the comforter actually move. This was the only time that he was comforting. Once I was cleaning the impossible steps when I saw him, sitting on the landing looking up at me. He was only about 8. I would say, but big for his age. He had his head shaved and was very pale. He was wearing a navy blue, what seemed to be a school uniform to me, with shorts on, with little military-type piping up the sides. There was something on his jacket lapel, and his eyes and head were big. He looked sad. I wasn't really scared of him at all then, and I seemed to hear his name in whispers reverberating off of the walls. I was in bed one night when he said, "Mommy, I'm scared," as clear as anything in my ear, and I flew down 3 flights of stairs, cursing like I never curse, all sorts of blasphemies concerning the house, to the extent of, "I hate this house, I can't wait to get the hell out of this house, I hate you." I felt very bad afterwards, of course, but it scared me because I knew all at once that he was always going to be scared. I felt bad for him, but I really did not like it that he wanted me to be his mother either. I think he died there of tuberculosis or the flu. There was a flu epidemic in Pittsburgh in the 20s that killed 1 in 7. I moved from the house on several occasions, but it had a way of sucking you back. The first time that I moved from there, I had a terrible headache like I've never known. I actually felt faint, and the room seemed to spin as if I was drunk. It felt like someone was pushing down on my head. When I left and came back for the rest of my stuff, all the doors were wide open, front and back. Of course, I had locked them because I'm obsessive compulsive. about locks like that. The last time, right before I moved out, I felt something in the bed up there with me. Jumped up, turned the light on, freaking. Another time I was in the bed, I could hear wings flapping in the room, big wings, flapping. It could not have been an angel, or at least I didn't think so at the time. Just before I left, I saw a demon. Only for a second, on the countertop in the kitchen by the sink. This is why I wonder if it's not just that little demon alone in the house playing tricks. He was only about as big as a little dog, and was gray with wings, like a bat. He was hairless and had little horns. He would have looked like a gargoyle if it wasn't for the horns. I'm glad to be out of that house. Next time I'll go on to ghost stories about places that I've visited. The John Bonnet being the first of them. Chapter 7. The John Bonnet Tavern sits along Route 30, the old Lincoln Highway, and my favorite road. Circa 1762, it is a beautiful stone lodging with 2 levels of wraparound porches and old wooden shutters. Bedford, Pennsylvania is one of the oldest towns and the former home of the Shawnee. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 began in the basement of the tavern. I had taken my mother to lunch there on several occasions as they have delicious food before my first stay. I love Bedford as it is a quaint old town. The first time I stayed at the John Bonnet, I was on my way to Gettysburg and I decided to stay in Bedford for the night. It was spring. I walked up the old porch and the door just opened on its own, what I refer to as monster style. It was not windy that day. The owners are mother and daughter and really wonderful. The girl told me that she had 1 room available. She looked at me kind of funny and said, "Nobody has stayed there since we bought the place. We only just finished it yesterday, so it still smells like paint. I'm excited what you'll think." She took me up to the room, which was alone at the top of the small staircase just inside the front door. It was actually 2 adjoining rooms and a small bath. The second room where I slept led out to the second-story porch. I went out that day, and when I got back, I couldn't unlock my door. I felt stupid, as I did each time I left the room, as I could never get back in and had to bother the girl to unlock the door each time. The real problem, however, began when I tried to go to sleep. I had a nightmare. A tall, thin man with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, brown, tight buckskin pants, a dirty white blouse, and tall leather boots was attacking me. He had a little whip, like jockeys use on a horse in a race. There was a woman in the dream, too, only she was distant somehow, as she just seemed to stare quietly at us, with little reaction to what was going on. She was small, fuller-figured, with dark hair pulled back into a bun, and was wearing a red gingham dress with a full skirt. I remember them so clearly because not only do I rarely have nightmares, but each time I'd awake scared and sweating, hear riotous noise downstairs in the bar, which seemed strange to me on a weeknight so late in Bedford, go back to sleep only to find myself back in his clutches. I must have had that dream ongoing for the rest of the night. The next day I felt very tired and drained. There was an empty journal on the dresser for guests to document their stay and leave their remarks. I remember thinking that I would not write in it as I felt ashamed. I did. I described the 2 of them, only I left out the attack and only said that the man was used to having his way. The next time I stayed there in the big posh room, and I wasn't alone. Nothing strange happened, and no dreams. A couple of years later, however, I was reading a little paperback publication called Booze and Brews about haunted taverns. I could have died when I got to the chapter about the John Bonnet because this is what it said. Sometime during the 18th century, a man had stolen horses from the Shawnee and ran to the Jean Bonnet for sanctuary. The keepers of the establishment at that time were on good terms with the Shawnee, only feared them as there were a lot more Shawnee than them. Horse thievery was a hanging error in those days. The natives would always get you for stealing a horse. The proprietors and colonists took a vote to decide what to do with the man. In order to appease the Shawnee, they decided to hang him, which they did at the top of the staircase just inside the front door and directly under the room where I stayed. I realized that most people would have had a horsewhip back in those days, but I cannot understand how else my imagination could have formulated such a thing in a dream. Chapter 8. Civil War Ghosts. This will be the longest chapter of installments. I try to keep it short as I realize the attention spans of people around here are given considering all of media. I follow the Civil War driving, usually traveling alone, but I've taken companions along from time to time. 10 years ago, my friend talked me into going to Gettysburg with him. I didn't even want to go, but it was a motorcycle trip and I thought it might be fun. Afterwards, I went at least once a month because I fell in love with the place. It seemed to call me back and I'd follow out of compulsion. I live a lot closer now. Gettysburg seemed magic to me, as there was a swirling mist caught up with glittering gold all about the ground. I find it interesting that the Native Americans had cursed the land after it was stolen from them and that 30,000 white men had torn each other to bits there. A lot of the Civil War battlefields have Native names: Antietam, Chattanooga, Chickahominy, and Chickamauga, which literally translates into River of Blood. Ironically, Shiloh means City of Peace in Hebrew. This photograph, which you cannot see, was taken in Gettysburg National Cemetery, where I pay my respects regularly. The place was a cemetery prior to the war. The soldiers fought and died there, using tombstones for cover. I was waiting for my friend and snapping photographs around the monument where supposedly Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, although in reality he was actually a couple of yards back in the oldest part of the cemetery. There are a series of beautiful statues lying about the bottom of the monument. You can't possibly get them all in one shot, so I had taken 3 pictures of the monument, one of each statue. This is the only shot that came back like this. It is on the negative. This was not there. I did not see it. There was no mist that day, and I was not smoking, as I had none, and I was waiting for my friend to return with them while I was taking the pictures. The last time I was in the cemetery, I kept turning around because I knew someone was right behind me, coming right up on me, but there was nobody there. The Cashtown Inn on the way to Gettysburg is haunted. The innkeeper had explained to me how to unlock the door before I went into town. I remember saying, "Or else you'll wake up the whole house." When I got back that night, I couldn't get in. The door had a series of locks. Just when I had given up and I knew I'd be waking up the whole house, the door opened magically, monster style. I know it was locked as I couldn't get in and my hand was not even on the door at the moment. Later, just before morning, I was awakened with a jolt. Something had actually passed through me, picked me up a couple of inches, and dropped me back down upon the bed. There was a journal in the room to log your stay. I did not document it because, again, I felt foolish and ashamed. The Inn publishes little paperback editions which are compilations of the journal logs left by guests. I picked one up before I left. A woman had that very same experience in that same room, only her husband was in the bed with her to witness it. Supposedly the ghost was the first rebel that they saw come into town. A year prior to the battle, a man had his horse stolen by a rebel and vowed to shoot the first one he ever saw come back to town. He made good on his promise, shot the reb off his horse, and drug him into the inn where he had died. A friend of mine had wanted to drive up to Culp's Hill after dark, which is not allowed. There was such an angry, swirling mist about the place, and I was so terrified that I made him turn around. I felt as if my heart was in an icy grip. The Forksworth house in Gettysburg is haunted, and is just across the street from the cemetery. Confederate sharpshooters hung up in the attic during the war. I love the owner and have stayed there a lot. Once when I entered my room, there was a cloud above my bed. You cannot smoke in historic establishments, and it was not smoke. I was in a tub there and heard whistling. I got scared but figured it to be the grandfather clock on the staircase. The next hour that the clock began to chime, I shut myself back in the bathroom to see if that was what I had heard. It wasn't. The house has a great tavern. I always pull out and head up to my room early before the drunks get too rowdy. You hear them barreling out of their rooms at all hours of the night, which is funny because the house is old, the pipes bang, the windows are drafty, and trucks passing by rattle the chandeliers and rock the chairs. I have also stayed at the James Geddes Hotel on several occasions, although I cannot recommend it. It served as a hospital during the war. Nearly every time that I've stayed there, I have gotten so sick as to cut short my stay and head home. I've had headaches, nausea, and fevers there. The groundskeeper in the 30s had run out of the house never to return, as he said he saw a glowing green apparition in the basement. Perhaps the most haunted place in Gettysburg is the Balindari Inn off of Little Round Top. It was a farmhouse during the war and became a field hospital. Amputated limbs were piled up to the window ledges around the house. My best friend and I stayed there to celebrate our birthdays. I would never stay there again. There were several rebel corpses that were found on the grounds and returned just within the last 20 years. We were using the Ouija board, calling a spirit to the board. I knew of a man who had been shot in the head and buried in the yard. I knew his name, age, and where he was from, but my friend did not. I had the most terrible sensation running up my arms, like an electric shock, and the board was corresponding correctly to my questions. I got scared and said, "Screw this," and wouldn't use the board again. Looking out the window of the bathroom, I could see something strange and glittery, hanging around the lamppost. For the rest of the night, we could hear rocks pelting our window, but when we'd look out there, would be nothing and nobody there. My friend was crying and wanted to leave. I told her to stop crying and go to sleep. To be perfectly honest, I was too afraid to open my eyes, let alone get out from under the covers, as I could hear and feel what seemed to be at least 6 people bumping about the room until I finally fell asleep. We had to laugh at the owner in the morning, though, because she had these big bug eyes as if she had been living there way too long. My mother and I were on a self-guided driving tour in Virginia, near where Stonewall Jackson had been shot from his horse, what has become known as the Wilderness. It was nearly dusk. I saw 2 Yankees to the left of me building a fire and was just about to say to her, "Look, reenactors," when they vanished from sight. They looked very solid and real. Next time will be a short one, I promise. The Linden Inn, Richmond, Virginia. Until then, happy haunting. Chapter 9. The Linden Inn, Richmond, Virginia. I took my mother away here for Mother's Day one year. Hollywood Cemetery is nearby. Edgar Allan Poe grew up here. By his time, the place was already an inn, and his mother was a traveling actress, so he had stayed here as a child. He played here what is known as the Garden with his friend Helen, who he later wrote to Helen for. I had the best meal of my life in the place, and the people were very gracious. We stayed in the garden, but I know it was the old kitchen of the place, separated from the main house by the courtyard. Most old places have separate kitchens in case of fire. We had a charming red brick cottage. All night as I slept, I kept waking up, smelling delicious food. It smelled as if it could only be coming from the room. The kitchen in the main house would have been closed for hours, and the smell was very strong. When I awoke in the early hours of the morning, there was a slender black woman standing over me, looking down on me and smiling. She had a long, full red skirt on and a white towel tied tight around her head. There was also a faint buzz of white light about her head. I was not the least afraid of her. She seemed quite nice. We had taken some pictures in the cottage, and there are orbs present, but I'm not a big buyer at saying orbs in pictures represent souls. I don't know. I think sometimes they might, but others are just tricks of flash. I worked in a school that used to be an old tuberculosis sanitarium for years. That's where I'll be taking you next time. Chapter 10. These are some of the first and second-hand stories of the supernatural at the school where I used to work. This one was the realest ghost I've ever seen. I was walking down the steps one morning, rummaging through my bag for my keys, paying no mind to the man in front of me with the dark hair and navy blue work suit. He could have been a guard or a health occupation student for all I knew, but when he got to the door right in front of me, he just vanished, walked through the door, and never opened at all. Shocked, I opened the door and looked around. He was nowhere. He looked very real and solid. He was about average height and build, nothing out of the ordinary. Once I was sitting outside, in the one old window, I could see three filmy faces melting into one another. First it was a boy about 11 years old with a blonde buzz cut. Then a thin woman with graying hair pulled back into a bun, with a frilly blouse with a high collar. Then a rather portly, balding man of about 40. I kept blinking my eyes, not believing what I was seeing. They were rather filmy, the three of them, and as I walked towards the window, bewildered, they finally ceased the supernatural slideshow. You would hear scrambling and papers being shuffled about in the classrooms in the early morning as you unlocked the classrooms. Most of the teachers there had witnessed this. One morning I came in and the computers were playing Glenn Miller. The computers could not have done that on their own, and the night watchmen were looking up porn, believe me. They did not listen to Glenn Miller. One night in the middle of the night, once right in the middle of class, the back cabinet started shaking and did not stop shaking until one of the students opened the door. The entire class witnessed this. Sometimes I'd see shadows and sparkles of gold flecks in the air. I kept this to myself as I figured it as a personal problem. One day one of my students said, "Hey, what are those shadows and sparkles in the air? Do you see them?" Impossible holes would appear in the bottoms of my paper coffee cups, or else my cup would just get swatted off my desk by nobody at all. I would get scared to stay there after dark. I'd hear strange noises and have to leave. But the students lived there. They stayed in the same rooms where the patients had passed away. They had lots of stories about the happenings at night there. They all told me, I guess they just knew. I had been there a long time, and the following ghosts must have been very active because a lot of students told me about a little blonde girl who played with a ball in the hallway of the honor dorm. The honor dorm was built in 1913 for children. TB killed 1 in 7 back then. The little girl asks for her mother, or she asks for you to tie her shoes. They said she looked like a real little girl. That is why they were so startled when she'd suddenly vanished. I noticed over time that she appeared to white girls who were pregnant. Another phantom reported by many students is a nurse who raps at their doors at night, reminding them to take their pills, and a man in a wheelchair. There was also a phantom tricycle that made its way about without a rider. Some of the students ran out and left due to the ghosts there. They were very scared. There were so many problems with some of the rooms that they were locked off limits and vacant, even though there was a shortage of rooms and a waiting list. The ghosts were very active if someone was reading from the Bible. Some students said that they were scratched in their sleep. The water was turned on mysteriously in their showers at night. Raps were reported, and strange childish voices were picked up on their answering machines. Teachers who had been there longer than me said that their clocks would be thrown off the wall. I did notice that my clock was always very wrong. One teacher told me that when the place first opened in the 80s, it had sat empty for 40 years and had never been blessed. She was working as an advisor in the dorms late one night when a girl returned from work and went to take a shower. She said the girl came running down the hall, drenched, naked, covered in soap, and screaming. She said that something had touched her in the shower. Then a huge shadow flew through the air down the hall and out the window. Another teacher told me that the ghost of a priest haunted her classroom. She said he looked very solid and real. He talked to her. He told her that her desk was where his bed was and that he had died there. She moved her desk and never saw him again. You would get cold shivers that passed through you in some of the doorways and halls. One night a security guard found a woman on the ground.